How does a girl from occupied Poland, a young woman forbidden by law and custom from entering a university, manage to shatter every conceivable barrier to become not just a great scientist, but arguably the world's greatest scientist? This is not merely a question of biography. It is a question of historical impossibility. It charts a journey from a nation that was officially erased from the map, a Vistula land crushed under the heel of the Russian Empire, to the absolute pinnacle of global intellectual achievement. It is the story of a mind so luminous and a will so indomitable that it defied the combined oppressions of imperialism, systemic poverty, and entrenched misogyny, ultimately illuminating the darkest secrets of matter itself, and forever changing the course of human history. Born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw, she was the daughter of educators, a fact that would define her entire existence. Her family was intellectual, patriotic, and, as a result, deeply impoverished. Her father, a teacher of physics and mathematics, had lost his position and savings due to his pro-Polish sentiments within the oppressive system of Russification, which actively sought to extinguish Polish language, culture, and thought. From her earliest childhood, Maria craved knowledge with an almost physical hunger. Yet she was confronted by a brutal reality. In Russian-ruled Poland, women were explicitly banned from all forms of higher education. Her gender and her nationality formed the bars of a cage she was determined to escape. Her determination forged an extraordinary pact. She would work as a governess, a menial, intellectually stifling job, sending her meager savings to Paris to fund her older sister Bronisława's medical studies. In return, once Bronisława was a doctor, she would fund Maria's escape. For years, Maria endured this intellectual exile, living in the homes of wealthy families, teaching children their sums while her own mind wrestled with the highest levels of physics and mathematics. She studied alone at night, by candlelight, reading advanced texts in secret, clinging to the dream of her own eventual escape to the Sorbonne, the distant beacon of light and knowledge. Arriving in Paris in 1891, at the age of 24, with almost no money to her name, the challenge seemed insurmountable. Could she, a poor, foreign woman who had taught herself advanced science, in isolation, truly survive in the intellectual capital of the world? More than that, could she possibly conquer the hallowed, all-male fortress of the Sorbonne, an institution that had only just begun to grudgingly admit women, treating them as novelties rather than as serious scholars? She was an outsider in every sense, a woman in a man's world, a Pole in Paris, a pauper among the privileged. She did not just survive, she endured. She moved into a chambre de bonne, a tiny, unheated attic room on the 6th floor, choosing poverty and isolation over the distractions of her sister's comfortable apartment. Her life became a study in ascetic devotion to knowledge. She lived on nothing but bread, butter, and tea, a diet so meager that she would frequently faint from hunger and cold. The water in her basin froze in the winter. She was often ill, her body emaciated. But while she fainted from lack of food, she never once wavered from a lack of determination. She was fueled by something far more potent than nutrition, a singular, burning ambition to learn. She faced the blatant, casual, and systemic sexism of the era. The male students, her peers, largely ignored her, a small, gray figure hidden at the back of the lecture halls. She was a curiosity, an anomaly, and certainly not considered a serious competitor. She ignored them in turn, her focus absolute. This quiet, starving woman from Poland then proceeded to demolish the competition. In 1893, she graduated licentiate in physics, ranking first in her entire class. As an afterthought, she decided to pursue a second degree, and in 1894, she graduated second in mathematics. What happens then when a brilliant, fiercely independent physicist, a woman who had thus far viewed romance as a frivolous distraction, from her one true love science meets the one man in the world capable of seeing her not as a woman or a wife, but as a scientific equal? This collision was not one she sought. Her plan was to finish her degree and return to Poland, to use her knowledge to fight for her homeland. But a simple, practical need would change her life and the world forever. In 1894, having secured a small research grant to study the magnetic properties of different steels, Maria Skłodowska needed laboratory space, a Polish physicist, an acquaintance, knew just the person. He introduced her to Pierre Curie, the 35-year-old laboratory chief at the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry EPCI. Pierre was a brilliant, bearded, and unconventional researcher, an idealist and an outsider himself, already renowned in physics for his work on crystals and piezoelectricity, but marginalized by the French academic establishment. Their bond was not romantic. At first, it was something deeper and more profound. It was a bond of instantaneous intellectual recognition. Their first conversations, which stretched for hours, were not small talk, but passionate discussions of science, of humanitarian ideals, of their shared contempt for fame and fortune. Pierre was astonished. He had finally found a mind that mirrored his own, and it belonged to this shy Polish student. They married in 1895, not in a church, not with a white dress, but in a simple civil ceremony. She wore a dark blue outfit, practical and sturdy, which she would wear in the lab for years. Their honeymoon was a bicycle tour of the French countryside. The world of physics was in a state of revolutionary ferment. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen had discovered X-rays. In 1896, Henry Becquerel, investigating this phenomenon, found that uranium salts, all by themselves, emitted mysterious rays that could fog a photographic plate. Even in complete darkness, it was a fascinating, accidental discovery. But where did these mysterious rays come from? The scientific community was intrigued, but quickly moved on to other, more fashionable topics. The search for an answer to this niche question, this scientific dead end, would change physics, warfare, and medicine forever. Marie Curie, searching for a topic for her doctoral thesis, made the most important decision of her career. She chose not to follow the crowd. She chose to investigate Becquerel's obscure uranium rays. It was a field that was new, that was small, and that was hers alone. Her approach was not qualitative like Becquerel's foggy plates. It was brilliantly quantitative. She used a revolutionary new tool, the electrometer, an instrument for measuring faint electrical currents that had been invented by Pierre and his brother, Jacques. It was this machine that allowed her to measure the intensity of the rays. Using this precise instrument, she began testing every element and compound she could find. She quickly confirmed that uranium emitted these rays. She then found that the element thorium did the same. But her measurements led her to a conceptual leap of staggering genius. She discovered that the intensity of the rays was not affected by temperature, pressure, or the chemical compound the element was in. A piece of pure uranium and a tube of powdered uranium salt of equal uranium content emitted the same charge. The rays, she deduced, were not a chemical interaction between atoms. They were coming from within the atom itself. She coined a new term for this phenomenon: radioactivity. This discovery shattered the 500-year-old model of the atom as a solid, indivisible, inert billiard ball. It was the birth of subatomic physics. Her systematic measurements then uncovered a profound mystery. She tested pitchblende, the raw, black, rocky ore from which uranium was extracted. Logically, it should have been less radioactive than pure, refined uranium. Her electrometer told her the opposite. The pitchblende was 4 to 5 times more radioactive than the pure uranium it contained. Her conclusion was immediate and inescapable. The ore must contain a new, unknown element, something present in tiny quantities, but possessing an atomic power hundreds of times greater than uranium. At this moment, Pierre Curie, seeing the magnitude of his wife's deduction, abandoned his own beloved research on crystals and joined her hunt. They worked for grueling years, not in a laboratory, but in a leaky, freezing, abandoned shed at the EPCI. It was a former dissecting room with a dirt floor, a leaky glass roof that dripped water onto their instruments, and no ventilation. Marie herself called it a miserable old shed, a stable, a hovel where they were choked by toxic fumes in the summer and frozen to the bone in the winter. They had no funding, no support, and no proper equipment. In this wretched shack, they would isolate the very soul of matter. The work was not delicate science. It was brutal, back-breaking industrial labor. They obtained tons of pitchblende waste from a mine in Bohemia, which was dumped in the yard outside their shed. Marie, a slight woman, spent her days shoveling the ore, boiling it in huge cast-iron vats, stirring the toxic, radioactive sludge with an iron rod as tall as she was, painstakingly separating the chemical components. It was a Herculean task of fractional crystallization. In July 1898, they announced the discovery of a new element, which Marie named polonium, a fiercely patriotic act for her lost homeland. Months later, in December 1898, they announced a second, even more potent element, radium, so powerful it glowed in the dark. In 1903, Marie Curie finally presented the findings of this monumental work for her doctoral defense. She stood before a panel of eminent scientists, the examinators, and became the first woman in the history of France to earn a doctorate in science. It was, quite possibly, the single greatest doctoral thesis ever written, a body of work that announced the discovery of two new elements, established a new field of physics, and fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of the universe. That same year, the Nobel Committee in Sweden announced its prize in physics. The nomination was for Henry Becquerel and Pierre Curie for their work on radioactivity. Marie's name was deliberately omitted. The committee, all male, had dismissed her contribution as that of a mere assistant. Pierre, in an act of profound integrity and intellectual honesty, was outraged. He wrote a letter to the committee stating unequivocally that he would refuse to accept the prize unless Maria's name was added. He declared that the original discovery was entirely hers. Forced by this ultimatum, the committee reluctantly added her name. In December 1903, Marie Curie became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. But fame was a burden, a disaster, as Marie called it. The press hounded them, not as scientists, but as miracle workers. The world became obsessed with radium, but the press, in its reflexive sexism, portrayed Marie as the loyal wife, an assistant to the great genius Pierre. Worse, their health was already failing. Their fingers were burned, scarred, and cracked from handling the radium. They were in constant pain, chronically fatigued, and suffering from what we now know was acute radiation sickness. They had discovered the elements, but those elements were already, silently, beginning to destroy them. How does a genius cope when her partner, the one person on earth who is her equal in both life and science, is suddenly, violently, and senselessly stolen from her? The Curie partnership was a perfect intellectual and emotional union, a single mind operating into bodies. His loss was an amputation that threatened to end her life, her work, and her very identity. The world held its breath, expecting the grieving widow to fade into obscurity. On April 19, 1906, a rainy Paris day, Pierre Curie was walking across the slick, busy Rue Dauphine. He slipped and fell into the path of a heavy, horse-drawn carriage. The rear wheel of the wagon crushed his skull, killing him instantly. The man who had wrestled with the fundamental forces of the atom was killed by the mundane, brutal mechanics of a horse and cart. The news was brought to Marie. She retreated into a shell of profound, silent, and terrifying grief, her diary entries from the time a haunting record of a mind. Shattered, Marie was shattered, but she refused to be crushed. The world expected her to retire, a tragic widow. The French government and the Sorbonne offered her a state pension, the traditional reward for a great man's wife. She refused it with contempt. She did not want a pension. She demanded his job. The university, stunned, relented. In November 1906, Marie Curie took over Pierre's professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first female professor in the institution's 600-year history. She walked into the packed lecture hall, a pale, black-clad figure, and began her first lecture at the exact sentence where Pierre's last lecture had left off, a symbolic act of continuity and iron-willed defiance. In 1911, her work continued, culminating in the isolation of pure radium metal, a feat that proved its elemental nature beyond all doubt. For this, she was awarded a second Nobel Prize. This time in chemistry. She remains, to this day, the only person, man or woman, to win the Nobel Prize in two different scientific fields. This prize was hers alone, a definitive answer to all who had dismissed her as a mere assistant. She won it, scandalously, in the midst of the vicious Langevin affair, where a xenophobic and sexist press campaign tried to destroy her for a private romance, proving her resilience was as potent as her intellect. When World War I erupted in 1914, how did this two-time Nobel laureate, this purely academic scientist, respond? She did not retreat to her lab. She saw the patriotic hysteria and the brutal casualty lists and immediately understood that her science could save lives. She saw that surgeons on the front lines were operating blind, amputating limbs that could be saved because they could not locate bullets and shrapnel. Her answer was X-rays. Marie saw that X-rays could save soldiers, but the X-ray machines were all in city hospitals, far from the front. So, she invented mobile radiography. She went to wealthy patrons and begged for cars. She went to university laboratories and stripped them of their X-ray equipment. She learned to drive, learned basic auto mechanics, and figured out how to power the delicate equipment. With a car's engine, she created mobile X-ray vans, equipping them herself, and prepared to drive them into a war zone. She and her daughter, Erin, then just a teenager, drove these vans, which became known to the soldiers as Petites Curie's Little Curies, directly to the casualty clearing stations and makeshift hospitals near the battlefields. In the mud, the blood, and the chaos, this 47-year-old, world-famous scientist and her young daughter worked tirelessly training medics, positioning wounded men, and using the X-rays to locate the shrapnel and bullets that were crippling them, allowing surgeons to operate with precision. They are credited with saving over 1 million lives. She had no protection. In the desperate rush of the war, there was no time or thought for safety. She and Erin were working with primitive, completely unshielded X-ray tubes. She was exposing herself and her child to massive, constant, and unmeasured doses of radiation, day after day, for years. The very rays she was using to save others were pouring into her own body, a sacrifice she was making with little understanding of the ultimate cost. What was the hidden cost of her heroic work? After the war, she was a global icon, but she was exhausted, a fatigue she dismissed as the simple toll of the war. But the first, insidious signs of a deeper sickness were beginning to show. The constant pain in her hands, the chronic weakness, the bouts of illness, all were dismissed as simple exhaustion. The price of her labor, the physical decline, became undeniable. Her fingers, which had been scarred by radium burns for decades, were now chronically cracked, inflamed, and in constant pain. More alarmingly, her eyesight began to fail. She was developing severe cataracts, a known side effect of intense radiation exposure. She kept her failing vision a secret for as long as she could, even undergoing multiple surgeries in private, terrified that if the world knew she was weakening, she would lose control of her beloved Radium Institute. But she kept working. She kept handling radium. She continued to lead the Radium Institute in Paris, a global beacon for the new science of physics and its medical applications. She could not, or would not, connect her own failing health to her life's work. The science she had birthed, the elemental fire she had stolen from the atom, was now, slowly and silently, beginning to kill her. The architect of the atomic age was becoming its first and most famous victim. By 1934, the fatigue became debilitating. The weakness was no longer a passing ailment. It was overwhelming. She could barely stand. Her body, which had endured so much poverty, starvation, toxic fumes, and decades of radiation, was finally shutting down. But what was it? The world's greatest scientist was dying of a mystery illness. Doctors were completely baffled. They suggested tuberculosis, a return of an old lung ailment. They prescribed rest in the mountains. No one, not even the experts at her own institute, made the connection between her current, catastrophic illness and her life's work. The cause was hidden in plain sight, in the very air she breathed in her lab, and in the glowing vials she had cherished for decades. Finally, in the spring of 1934, she was taken to the Saint-Chalemos Sanatorium in Passy, France. A test, a simple blood count, at last revealed the truth. Her blood was a disaster. Her body had all but stopped producing red and white blood cells. The diagnosis was stark and fatal, aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow was dead. What caused it? The realization, when it finally came from the sanatorium doctor, was horrific. It wasn't just the acute X-ray exposure from the war that had merely been the final insult. It was her child, her great discovery. Her beloved element, radium, she used to carry vials of radium salts in her pockets. Simply because she loved their fairy-like glow, she and Pierre would stand in their dark shed, mesmerized by the beautiful, pale blue light. She kept a glowing vial by her bedside as a nightlight. It was her treasure. That soft, ethereal glow was the radiation. It was the physical manifestation of alpha, beta, and gamma rays pouring from the unstable atoms. For more than 30 years, that radiation had been passing through the glass, through her clothes, penetrating deep into her body, and systematically, relentlessly destroying the stem cells in her bone marrow. The element she had given to the world, the light she had brought forth from the darkness had, in turn, taken her life. She was taken to the Saint-Chalemos sanatorium in Passy, France, to die. Her body was broken, shattered by her own discovery, but her mind, to the very end, was still a scientist's. She remained lucid, curious, and famously stoic, reportedly examining her own blood count, charts with a detached, professional interest. Her body had failed, but her intellect remained indomitable. She died on July 4, 1934, at the age of 66. The official report from the sanatorium's director was chilling in its simple clarity. Her death was from aplastic anemia, the patient having been exposed for a long period to radiation. The long, invisible battle between the discoverer and her discovery was finally over. She was a martyr to her own discovery, like an explorer who tastes an unknown fruit and finds it to be a deadly poison. Marie Curie had paid the ultimate price for her curiosity. She had entered a new, invisible world of subatomic forces, and its unknown dangers had claimed her. She was killed by the very children, polonium and radium, that she had unlocked from the atom. Even today, nearly 100 years after her death, her physical presence remains, and it is a toxic one. Her personal effects, her home, and her laboratories are still contaminated. Her notebooks, filled with her elegant script detailing the birth of radioactivity, are stored in lead-lined boxes in France's Bibliothèque Nationale. They are dangerously radioactive. To this day, any historian or researcher who wishes to read her original notes must first sign a liability waiver acknowledging the risks. They must then wear protective gear, including gloves and masks, to prevent the inhalation or ingestion of radium dust, which still clings to the pages. Her notebooks are, in effect, hazardous waste, a tangible and terrifying testament to the power she unleashed. This toxic inheritance, this intimate dance with radiation, was passed on to her own child, her daughter Joliette Curie, who had worked by her side in the mobile X-ray vans during WWI and later in the lab, went on to win her own Nobel Prize in Chemistry with her husband Frederick for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. And in 1956, also died, just as her mother had, from a radiation-induced blood disease, leukemia. How, then, was this very killer, this beautiful, glowing, and deadly element, harnessed to become a cure? This is the central, profound paradox of Marie Curie's life. The same property that made radium so dangerous, its ability to emit high-energy radiation that damages and destroys living tissue, is also its greatest promise. Her work with radium and her creation of the Radium Institute in Paris became the foundation for modern radiotherapy. The monster she had unleashed, when targeted and controlled, became one of humanity's greatest weapons against cancer. The rays that indiscriminately destroyed her bone marrow could be focused to destroy the rapidly dividing cells of a tumor. Curiotherapy, as it was first known, has saved and extended the lives of countless millions, a direct and beautiful legacy born from her own tragic poisoning. She broke every barrier that 19th century society had erected. As a woman, she was told she could not learn, so she graduated first in her class. As an immigrant, she faced xenophobia, yet she became a symbol of French science. As a scientist, she was told her place was as an assistant, so she became the only person in history to win 2 Nobels into different sciences. Her discoveries did not just add to science, they defined a new era of physics and medicine. Her conceptual leap that radioactivity was an atomic property was the singular event that marks the birth of the atomic age. All of nuclear physics, all of modern oncology, all of the vast, terrifying, and promising power of the atom stands on the foundation of the work she did in that miserable shed. But her sacrifice defined a new era of human devotion to knowledge. Her true legacy is not just her list of accomplishments, but her character, her absolute integrity, her refusal to patent radium and profit from it, a decision that would have made her fabulously wealthy, and her selfless, almost monastic devotion to the pure pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of humanity. Marie Curie proved that one person, driven by an insatiable curiosity, could illuminate the entire world. She peeled back the veil of reality to show us a new, glowing, and terrifying universe hidden within the one we thought we knew. She brought forth a new light, a fairy-like glow that would define the 20th century, even if that light was, in the end, the very one that consumed her.
Before we move on, a brief note from the creators of the History Profile. They're a small, dedicated team who spend weeks researching and crafting each episode to share history truthfully. If you value this dedication, subscribing helps them continue this work.